Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first lecture of the 2018 Great Lives Series, which marks the beginning of our 15th year of this program. As always, we've tried to put together a diverse schedule of lectures. I encourage you to pick up schedules and bookmarks in the foyer when you leave, and we hope to see you frequently over the next 4 months. Now, those of you who've been with us before will remember 3 people who are back to help us this year, once again, with our program. And they are, I don't necessarily see them, but I'm sure they're all here, Brian Jones, our Associate Director. Where's Brian? Stand up, Brian. Kelly Reeder, our Program Assistant. Kelly. And the indispensable Allie Gouch-Heber, the university's coordinator of community events, who handles all the program logistics, which is really the tough part. Allie, thank all of you for what you do. Now, before introducing our speaker for the evening, let me say something that you will hear repeatedly during the series, and that is how much we appreciate all our donors who really are the ones who make this series possible, because, frankly, state funds are far from sufficient to cover the costs of our program, so your support is crucial. And in that regard, pledge cards are available in the foyer. I encourage you to consider making a contribution if you've not already done so. And so thanks to all of our individual donors, and, of course, to our wonderful corporate sponsors, beginning with tonight's sponsor, Synergy Prosthodontics and Implants. And let me ask the Synergy owners of that practice to stand, Dr. Lily Pittman and her husband, Dr. Thanos Dunas. Thank. And now for tonight's program. The subject is Jonas Salk, a name that I suspect, and in fact I know, is largely unknown to today's student generation. My class is right here in front. We met Tuesday, and I asked them how many people knew Jonas Salk, and only a few timid hands went up. Not too much known to that generation. But to those in my age cohort, and I suspect that many of you fall into that category, that name is, Jonas Salk, is immortal. As the man whose discovery of the polio vaccine removed one of the greatest fears of our childhood. And I can still recall the elation and the relief that we felt when we heard the announcement of that discovery. And as a matter of fact, I can still remember where I was standing when I heard that announcement for the first time. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Charlotte Jacobs, is the preeminent authority on the life and work of that iconic figure in the history of medicine. She is also that rare scholar who has achieved prominence in 2 distinct areas. Having earned a doctorate from the Washington University School of Medicine, she has had a lengthy career as an oncologist at Stanford, where she has engaged in teaching, cancer research, and patient care, and is currently Professor Emerita of Medicine. But midway through her medical career, she turned to the writing of biography, and with spectacular success, including the 2015 publication of Jonas Salk, A Life, on which this lecture will be based and which is available for purchase and signing in the foyer after the lecture. That work was described by the Wall Street Journal as, quote, a sweeping and sympathetic narrative, and praised by the New York Times as a poignant and elegantly crafted work that is science writing at its best. And as if that dual career were not sufficiently diverse, I should mention that she has also written a musical comedy and has won praise for her performances in community theater. So it's indeed a pleasure to welcome to the Great Lives podium to begin our 2018 season, Dr. Charlotte Jacobs.
Thank you. It is quite an honor to be here participating in the William Crawley Great Lives Lecture Series. I want to thank Synergy for their wonderful support of this lecture. I want to thank Bill and Terry for being such great host and hostess, and Brian Jones for being the president of, past president of our Biographers International organization. Well, when I was a child, poliomyelitis cast a shadow over every summer. Magazines, newspapers, newsreels carried photos of innocent children who were struggling in braces or entombed in iron lungs. This highly contagious viral illness appeared every May and then mysteriously disappeared after Labor Day, leaving thousands maimed or dead. Nobody could predict which town or which child would be the crippler's next victim. So, movie theaters, swimming pools were closed, birthday parties canceled, but no matter how hard parents tried, there was nothing they could do to protect their children. Fear pervaded the country. In 1954, my hometown of Kingsport, Tennessee, was selected as a trial site for Jonas Salk's polio vaccine. I participated in that trial, and I was proud to be called a polio pioneer. On April 12, 1955, it was announced that the trial had been a success. Polio had been conquered, and Jonas Salk became the hero of my generation. Over the years, I wondered what happened to Jonas Salk. Having achieved such great success at age 40, what did he do for an encore? Well, finding no formal biography to inform me, I set out to write one. I spent many years going through his extensive archives at the University of California in San Diego and the March of Dimes archives in White Plains, New York. I interviewed over 100 of his colleagues, friends, and family, and here's what I found. Jonas Salk was born on October 28, 1914, in East Harlem. His mother told him that he was born with a caul, the amniotic membrane covering his face, and that meant that he was destined for greatness. Well, that was pretty unlikely because he was a shy, submissive, first-generation Jewish immigrant who was much more comfortable with his books. But he believed her, and every day he used to pray that someday he would perform some noble deed. Salk also longed to be a success and to be accepted by his peers, hence the caption under his high school yearbook picture, Mr. Big Shot, and his subsequent marriage to a fashionable young lady from an affluent Manhattan family. Well, fresh out of medical training at the New York University and Mount Sinai Hospital, Jonas and his new wife, Donna Lindsay, moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan. There he attached himself to Thomas Francis Jr., who was an esteemed virologist. Pearl Harbor had just been bombed, and as the U.S. prepared to go to war, an influenza outbreak threatened the troops. Now, this brought back terrible memories of the great Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, in which almost as many young men died of influenza as died in the war. They desperately needed a flu vaccine. And in a race against time, Salk helped Francis make the first influenza vaccine. And he carried out most of the trials to show its efficacy and its safety, for which Thomas Francis got most of the accolades. Well, after a few years, Salk was feeling a little stymied by Francis. He wanted his own laboratory. He wanted independence. So he took a position at the University of Pittsburgh, which at the time was a rather undistinguished medical school. There, he set out to make what he called a universal influenza vaccine, one that would cover all the different strains of influenza. But he was constantly blocked in his work by the more senior scientists in the field. So in 1947, when Harry Weaver, who was the director of research for the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, or better known as the March of Dimes, came to him to ask if he would join them in the attack on polio, he readily agreed. The director, the very powerful director, who's actually seen in the middle background there, was Basil O'Connor. He was the director of the National Foundation, and he put together a group of elite polio scientists to help him in his approach to polio prevention. He called them the Committee on Immunization. Now, one of the most outspoken members of that committee is seen on the left there. That is Albert Sabin, who was really quite a bombastic man, but held in high regard among polio scientists. Well, Sabin was content to let young Salk do some of the more menial tasks, such as determine the exact number of different types of polio virus that existed. Little did he know that behind that feigned complacency lacked a renegade researcher who would make and test the first polio vaccine behind the committee's back while they were busy arguing about the optimal approach to polio. In 1952, 57,000 Americans developed polio. Salk didn't want to stand in line behind this cadre of senior scientists waiting for them to set their timeline for making a vaccine. He had a different agenda, to which only Basil O'Connor and Harry Weaver were privy. Salk had decided that he would make his own vaccine. Now, there were two ways in which that vaccine was notable. The first was at that period in time, all the senior polio scientists, or most scientists, in fact, believed that the only way that you could get good immunity, lifelong immunity, against a viral disease was to use a live virus that was weakened in the vaccine, as had been the case in smallpox. Salk disagreed. He felt that you could kill a virus, make it safer, and still generate good immunity. But he held his cards close to his chest. He didn't want to go up against these very senior scientists. The second notable thing about that vaccine is Salk and his small laboratory at the University of Pittsburgh, not some large science institute or some major pharmaceutical house, made that first polio vaccine in just a little over 3 months. There was nobody like him in those days, Weaver recalled. His approach was entirely different from that which had dominated the field. He wanted to leap, not crawl. His willingness to shoot the works was made to order for us. Well, Salk conducted his trials at Watson Home for Crippled Children in Leesville, Pennsylvania, out of the public eye. He gave every shot and drew all the blood specimens himself. Years later, Salk said that the highlight for him in the entire polio saga was the first time he measured anti-polio antibodies in a child, that he knew then that he could prevent polio. Well, the staff at the Watson home, the children and their parents were all sworn to secrecy. Salk did not want the press hovering around, and he definitely didn't want the senior scientists in the Committee on Immunization, as they were called, to try to stop him. So, the time finally came when Basil O'Connor told him that he needed to present his results to the Committee on Immunization, and they sat stunned. When the questions started, Albert Sabin made it sound like Salk's results were absolutely improbable, humiliating him. And then a melee broke out with some of the scientists wanting to go ahead and use the Salk vaccine before the next polio season, and others saying, no, we have to wait until we get a live virus vaccine. That's the only thing that will be effective. Well, with the committee in total gridlock, Harry Weaver just selected a different committee. He named it the Vaccine Advisory Committee, and it was composed of public health officials, all of whom were in favor of using Salk's polio vaccine. But to Salk's chagrin, he told him that he could not conduct the vaccine trial himself, that his results would be considered suspect. So they appointed, the National Foundation appointed Thomas Francis Jr. to conduct the trial of Salk's vaccine. He agreed, but with several stipulations, the major one of which is he would give no early results of his trial to anyone, including Basil O'Connor, and not to Jonas Salk. So Jonas Salk had to stand on the sidelines for an entire year while this trial went on, and not being able to participate. He watched while the pharmaceutical companies who they chose to make the vaccine started taking a few shortcuts that he was afraid would affect its safety, where the powerful biologic control laboratory in Washington made changes to his formulation of his vaccine that he was afraid would change the efficacy. And then it seemed like just as they were rushing to get the vaccine out there before the next polio season, it seemed like every week there was some new problem. There were concerns about kidney damage. Then there were lots of vaccine that were contaminated with a live, very deadly virus. And then just when they thought they were on the way to the vaccine trial, the major needle manufacturing facility went on strike. And then finally, just the week before, Walter Winchell, who was a very prominent radio broadcaster, went on the air and warned parents, do not let your child participate in this trial. The vaccine may be a killer. But despite all of that, on April 26, 1954, Randy Kerr of McLean, Virginia, was vaccinated against polio. Now, never before and never again will there be such a trial. It was monumental in size, conducted solely in children, and funded and carried out by volunteers through the March of Dimes. On that day, almost 1 million first, second, and third graders at selected sites across the United States received, by random draw, either the placebo or the vaccine. And it was coded so that no one knew which the child was getting until the code was broken. Another amazing thing to me about this trial, besides the fact that it was enormous and conducted in children, was that it wasn't carried out by some professional pharmacy research group. It was carried out by an army of volunteers. There were 20,000 physicians, 40,000 nurses, 15,000 principals, 50,000 teachers, and 220,000 housewives. Francis and his statistical group received 144 million pieces of data that they entered onto IBM key punch cards. But despite all that, the trial went relatively smoothly. And true to his word, Francis did not tell Salk any of the results until breakfast the morning of the announcement, and Jonas Salk was to speak after him. Well, on April 12, 1955, 500 invited guests and 150 reporters gathered at the University of Michigan to hear the much anticipated results of the trial. Francis gave a kind of classic academic lecture, speaking in a monotone voice. He showed slides just chock full of data, and in fact, he was 55 minutes into his talk before he told the audience what they had come to hear. And that was that the polio vaccine had been 80 to 90% effective against paralytic polio and harmed not one child. Well, when Jonas Salk got up to talk, there was a standing ovation that went on and on and on. And when he finally finished his talk, celebration erupted across the nation. Church bells tolled, sirens rang, horns honked. People ran out into the street, hugging each other and crying. Storekeepers wrote, "Thank you, Dr. Salk," on their store windows. Churches and synagogues had impromptu prayer meetings. PA systems in schools and in factories across the United States called for a moment of silence. And then the presses started rolling. "Polio is conquered," read headlines across the world. People thinking back to those days compare it to a celebration of the end of a war. I was surprised by what followed. This young American hero, whose picture was on every single magazine, newspaper, even postage stamps, did not live happily ever after. Jonas Salk suffered a great deal of pain from his fame. He used to describe it as the proverbial albatross around his neck. At the day of the announcement, Edward R. Murrow had said to him, "Young man, a great tragedy has befallen you. You have just lost your anonymity." Well, it didn't take Salk long to figure out what he meant. Now, Salk had assumed he would just go back to Pittsburgh and go back to his laboratory and start on his next project. Oh, no. Within a month, he or the University of Pittsburgh on his behalf received 10,000 gifts, letters, telegrams, and phone calls. And Salk initially tried to write thank you notes to everyone. Well, that of course, fell by the wayside pretty quickly. He couldn't walk down the street without people coming up and wanting to shake his hand and slap him on the back. If he walked into a restaurant, he caused a stir like a movie star. He was really suffocating, although he really had a lot of gratitude for the response of the public. But then he started to sense the downside of fame, the con artists, the stalkers, the obsessives. Years later, he said to a writer of the New York Times, "It's as if I've been public property ever since. It brought me enormous gratification, opened many opportunities, but at the same time placed many burdens on me. It altered my career, my relationships with colleagues. I am a public figure, no longer one of them." Well, while the public rushed to honor Salk, the scientific community remained ominously silent. I mean, Jonas Salk had just made a vaccine that could prevent a highly deadly disease. You'd think he could have been able to revel in the glory of that achievement, but the shadow, the rebuke from the scientific community cast a shadow over his accomplishment. Well, now, what in the world could have been their aspersions? Well, first, this young man who was not a member of the scientific brotherhood had made and tested a vaccine behind their backs, challenging their most firmly held principle that only a vaccine made with a live, albeit weakened, virus could give good, long-lasting immunity. Secondly, some of them accused him of grabbing the limelight with failure to recognize the others who had paved the way for the polio vaccine. Well, that wasn't quite fair. I mean, Salk had mentioned their names on many occasions, but the public wasn't interested in Tom Rivers or John Enders. The press, in making Salk the focal point for the entire polio saga, had turned him into an international icon. So, Salk received awards from heads of states around the world, the Presidential Citation, the Nehru Award, the French Legion of Honor, and on, but he received very little recognition from the scientific community. Although nominated 3 times for the Nobel Prize, the 5-man committee passed over him, saying that his work was really not prizeworthy. But probably more egregious is that he was blackballed from the National Academy of Sciences, which is kind of the elite society for American scientists. Some of them said that his work was really not an original discovery, and they kind of likened him to a director of research for a pharmaceutical house. Perhaps the most egregious was Albert Sabin, who used to call Salk's work kitchen chemistry. He'd say, well, you could just go into the kitchen and do what Salk did. Well, I have to say that Salk did contribute a little bit to their dislike or disparaging of him, I would say. Salk reached out to the public in ways that few physician scientists ever had. I mean, seriously, what distinguished scientist would give an interview to Good Housekeeping or Parents Magazine or go on television and show the public how to make a vaccine using a Waring blender? Well, Salk did. But he told his long-term secretary that he did it because he felt beholden to the public. They had supported his research with their dimes, and they had given up their children to participate in a clinical trial. Well, the scientific community didn't see it that way. They thought that he had crossed that fine line of proper academic decorum and was pandering to the press. But let's face it, with the success of that vaccine came a wave of celebrity accorded few physicians in the history of medicine. Don't discount envy, one of his colleagues said. Envy is fierce in the world of science. Well, all of that may be painful to Salk, but not nearly as painful as the fate of his vaccine. So the scientific community considered his vaccine kind of like a stopgap, that it wouldn't really give long-term immunity, and they really needed that live virus vaccine, and Albert Sabin delivered. He made a vaccine that was oral. It could be delivered in a sugar cube. Many of you may remember that. And he tested it extensively in Russia and several other countries, showing that it was safe and effective. In the early 1960s, the Public Health Service withdrew the Salk vaccine and replaced it with the Sabin vaccine, citing cost and convenience and better immunity. Well, Salk was distraught, not because it was his vaccine, but didn't they understand that a live virus, although weakened, could revert to a more virulent form, and that the vaccine might actually cause polio? Nah, Sabin said. Salk went up against every single major medical group in the United States. The American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Medical Association, the World Health Organization, the FDA, the Surgeon General. He even went to Congress, and nobody listened to him. They just turned their backs. And with time, actually, there were cases in the United States of polio from the live virus vaccine. But they were small in number, and the Sabin vaccine was already well integrated into the healthcare system, and no change was made. Jonas Salk spent the rest of his life trying to reverse what he called a risky, politically driven decision as a lone warrior. Well, treated like a scientific rock star for years, Salk sought refuge. He had always dreamed of having an institute where scientists and humanists would work side by side, as he said, imbuing the sciences with the conscience of man. And with funding from Basil O'Connor and the National Foundation, he was able to hire a very famed architect, Louis Kahn, who designed a magnificent building placed in La Jolla, California, overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Against Salk's wishes, it was called the Salk Institute for Biological Studies. There, Salk was able to attract quite a number of Nobel Prize-winning scientists and outstanding humanists, offering them lifetime funding and complete autonomy. Well, the Salk Institute did not turn out to be the refuge that Salk had hoped for. He faced many, many problems, starting with the famed architect who spent more time dreaming than drawing and delayed the opening of the Institute for 2 years. Salk's own poor administrative skills, which left the Institute teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. Salk's fall from grace of Basil O'Connor. A subsequent president of the Salk Institute who said, "I could raise more money with Salk dead than alive." And finally, disposal by those very scientists and humanists for whom he had built this Shangri-La. Salk said he felt like a pariah in his own home. Several years later, the greatest disappointment came, and that is that science began to dominate the Institute. When asked by a reporter many years later, "You must be so proud of the Salk Institute," Salk said, "It's only half my dream, the biology half of my dream. The humanity half of my dream has not been fulfilled, so I am only half happy." Well, during this struggle, Salk finally was able to return to his laboratory, and the press and the public and the funding agencies were all asking the same question: okay, what's next? Well, the answer that Salk gave was not very satisfying. He said he was setting out to harness the immune system. Now, what that meant to Salk is that he was going to attack two disparate diseases: cancer, in which the immune system had failed, and multiple sclerosis, in which the overactive immune system destroyed nerve cells. Well, his cancer work just underscored his unfamiliarity with modern molecular biology. And the scientists at the Salk Institute worried that it would really discredit the Institute, connived to shut down Salk's laboratory. His work on multiple sclerosis was more credible. He actually had isolated a protein that he thought was responsible for multiple sclerosis. And he was starting a trial of a treatment based on that, which was looking a little bit beneficial. So his multiple sclerosis work was more credible. But then when he opened a big national trial, somehow it didn't work any longer. And all the patients were developing severe allergic reactions, which he could not stop. His funds were running out, his lab closed down, and Jonas Salk left the field of multiple sclerosis forever. So, Jonas' works defined him, leaving little time for his three sons, Peter, Daryl, and Jonathan, and his wife, Donna. The press used to love to show pictures of the Salk family getting ready to fly a kite, reading together, having a family barbecue, but in fact, those things rarely happened. When the boys became teenagers, they were sent east to boarding schools. But perhaps worse than having a legendary father was becoming a celebrity by association. Peter Salk was kind of a shy little guy. And he said it was so painful to him when he played Little League. Every time he got up to bat, everyone expected him to hit a home run because he was a Salk boy. His wife, Donna, could not adapt to the celebrity, and their marriage ended in divorce. A few years later, Salk met and married French artist Françoise Gillot, who was very well known for her popular book, Life with Picasso, in which she detailed her years as Picasso's mistress. Well, Salk's friends were shocked, to say the least, but they were even more shocked when they heard about all of her premarital demands, of which he agreed to all of them, including that she could live in Paris 6 months out of the year by herself so she could paint. But his friends had to agree that they had never seen Salk look so healthy and so happy. His whole dress and demeanor changed. In fact, his sister-in-law used to say that Jonas was Frenchified. Well, as the years went on, their relationship seemed more intellectual than affectionate. One of Salk's neighbors said to me, "I think Jonas spent more time with his housekeeper, Jose, than with Françoise." For years, Jonas awoke in the middle of the night with all kinds of thoughts running through his head. And so he'd get up and write them down. He called them his night writings. And these became the basis for 4 philosophical books, starting with one called Man Unfolding, in which he was very concerned about man's place in the cosmos. His books were not well received, particularly by the public, who really had trouble understanding his kind of circuitous ramblings. And so they weren't well received. In fact, at the Salk Institute, some of the humanists were humiliated by his books. One of them used to refer to Salk as the prophet. But Salk cared deeply for mankind. He was very concerned about the future. And he was frustrated as he grew older and he had more trouble communicating to the public in ways that they could understand. So he welcomed anyone who could help him in that, and in doing so collected a small group of would-be torchbearers to help him, who were mostly very bright, attractive young women. Well, in his 70s, Salk suffered from a serious depression. One of his friends, who was a psychiatrist, was afraid that he was going to commit suicide. He felt that he had not lived up to his own expectations. And then he heard the clarion call from AIDS. He noticed, when he realized that all these young men were dying from some mysterious illness caused by HIV, he entered the AIDS arena. Some of the younger scientists kind of smirked, "Oh, here's an old guy trying to regain his former glory." One colleague called him the Rip Van Winkle of science. But Salk played a very important initial role as Solomon when 2 star scientists, one American, one French, were fighting over who discovered the AIDS virus. And it was really stifling the whole field. And Salk was able to solve that and keep from actually having an international incident but involving the 2 presidents. But then Salk was very disturbed by the fact that most scientists weren't rushing to come up with any treatment or prevention. They were much more interested or involved in trying to understand how the virus affected the immune system. Salk couldn't bear to think that every year thousands and thousands of more young men would be dying while they were in their laboratories trying to figure that out. So he formed a company, because his lab had been closed, called Immune Response, and he designed a treatment vaccine, one that he thought would delay the time between infection with the AIDS virus and development of full-blown AIDS. And he tested that vaccine at the University of Southern California. And in the first group of men he treated, he found that, in fact, the virus cleared out of their system and their immune systems were geared up. And he was very excited about it, and they decided to have a big national trial until he ran into the FDA, who was no longer as agreeable with Salk than he had been. Well, Salk's work in the AIDS field may have generated a lot of criticism from the scientific community, but Salk was still a media draw. And one of the most important things he did for the AIDS field is that he was able to convince the public that AIDS was not a disease just to be put over here among gay men, that AIDS was a disease that everyone in the public had to be concerned with. That was probably the most important thing that he did in the AIDS field. Well, in his later years, Salk was a very solitary figure. Francoise spent little time at home. In fact, when a reporter asked her about La Jolla, she said, "I wouldn't spend 5 minutes in La Jolla if it weren't for my husband." His grandsons, who he enjoyed, were very busy with their own lives, and he didn't have that many friends. And so he just kept working. He was busy advocating for everyone to get yearly influenza vaccines. He worked with the Mérieux company in France and developed a much better killed virus vaccine that could be incorporated right into the childhood inoculations. And he was starting to open, finally, a big AIDS trial of his vaccine when on June 23rd, 1995, he died. His heart had failed. Well, Jonas Salk had many legacies, the most important or the most notable of which was his polio vaccine. And we are nearing the fulfillment of his dream thanks to the Global Polio Eradication Initiative. This was started by Rotary. Maybe some of you are Rotarians here in the audience. If you are, you're among my favorite people. The World Health Organization, the UN, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. When this was initiated in 1988, 1,000 children were paralyzed with polio every day around the world. That is a mind-boggling figure. Last year, there were 20 cases of polio. Absolutely astounding. And the only sad side note to that is Jonas Salk was right about one thing. There were 86 cases that came from the vaccine. So in some of the developing countries where they were still using Sabin's live virus vaccine, 86 children were paralyzed. So still a little bit more work to be done, but we've certainly come a long, long way from 1,000 children a day. His second legacy, in 2011, one of the major immunization advisory committees for the government recommended that everybody over the age of 6 months get a yearly influenza vaccine. Salk was always afraid that there would be another pandemic that would wipe out the world. And I think he would be astounded now to see people getting their flu vaccine in pharmacies and grocery stores while they shopped. And finally, the Salk Institute does remain one of the most revered science institutes in the world. Well, I'd now like to turn a little bit to the challenges in writing Salk's biography. One of the very first challenges I faced was where to start. Do I start with his birth? Do I start with the moment of his glory? And at the time, I was doing a writing residency at the MacDowell Colony. And the first night, you all sit around the dinner table, and everyone goes around and talks about what their project is. And most of the other writers there were about the age of the students that we have here. And when I said I was writing about Jonas Salk, there were kind of some nice nods. I thought, I don't think they know who he is. So I said, you know, the polio vaccine. Oh, one said, of course, the sugar cube, right? Well, I realized that anybody born after 1955 really didn't have an idea what it was like growing up with polio. So I decided to start my book in 1916 when Jonas Salk was 2 years old and polio afflicted New York City. So I actually would like to read to you. In the summer of 1916, New York's playgrounds stood empty. No children splashed in public swimming pools. None sold lemonade on the sidewalks. No cats roamed the alleys, peering into garbage cans. Troops of sanitary workers in white uniforms hosed down the city streets. Fathers hurried home from work. Fear imparted on their faces, averting their glances from the tiny wooden caskets lined up outside the tenements. Policemen patrolled the street. New York was a city under siege. Poliomyelitis had crept into Brooklyn while the public was busy watching the war unfold in Europe. It smoldered for a while between Henry Street and 7th Avenue. Health officials barely paid attention, assuming it would soon die out, but it didn't. When the press began to attach names and faces to the disease, the community became alarmed. Helen Downing, paralyzed just before graduation from public school number 134, received her diploma in bed. 5-year-old Frederick Chaplin had just made his kindergarten's honor roll when he went to Coney Island with his brother. 5 days later, he was dead. Before long, the names and faces gave way to numbers, and they kept escalating. Although a scientist had identified the polio virus 8 years earlier, no one knew how it spread. Assuming it behaved like other contagious diseases, the health commissioner ordered every family bearing a case quarantined. A placard was placed in the window. Bed linens and clothing were disinfected. Their windows were screened to prevent flies from disseminating the disease. Street cleaners worked overtime to collect garbage and cleanse tenement halls and stairwells. Stray cats suspected of harboring the virus were rounded up and exterminated, 72,000 by summer's end. The commissioner closed playgrounds and banned children from theaters. But filth and flies and cats had nothing to do with the spread of poliomyelitis, and even with these precautions, more children contracted the disease. The illness started innocently enough, a sore throat, a runny nose. At the end of the day, the child spiked a fever, became restless. Then the pains began, electric shocks that darted through the back, legs, neck, and shoulders. Muscles twitched and spasms twisted him into a peculiar posture. All night the child thrashed about in bed, drenched in sweat. His face became pallid. When the fever broke, he appeared to be recovering. A deceitful interlude as the polio virus left the bloodstream and invaded the nervous system. Within a day or two, paralysis struck, as abruptly as the fever had, and no one could predict the nature of its onslaught. A weak leg, which improved in a few days, or an arm dangling useless forever. If the polio virus attacked the nervous system higher up in the base of the brain, death soon followed. Paralyzed throat muscles impeded swallowing. A sip of water streamed out his nose or drained into his windpipe, causing the youngster to sputter and cough. Unable to swallow saliva, he foamed at the mouth. Breathing gave way to gurgling. As his mother wiped the bloody froth from his lips, he gasped for air, drowning in his own secretions. The struggle over, his eyes rolled back, a few muscle jerks, and the mother held her lifeless child. Poliomyelitis seemed to have a predilection for infants and toddlers. During the second week of July, 412 new cases were reported in New York. The next week, 712. Terrorized parents watched the figures more closely than the stock market. The disease erupted in Staten Island, Manhattan, the Bronx. It didn't distinguish between immigrants and upper class. Those who could fled. Mothers swarmed into Grand Central Station and ferry docks, dragging their children into crowds they should have avoided. The exodus of almost 1,200 children a day halted when towns began to bar them. In Hoboken, New Jersey, policemen turned back 150 families trying to enter Hastings-on-Hudson. Distraught, they returned to New York, where the death toll continued to rise. Families lacking the whereabouts to provide medical assistance at home were ordered to deliver their infected children to Brooklyn's Kingston Avenue Hospital for Contagious Disease, where they were held in isolation for 8 weeks. Restricted for visiting, parents heard stories of hallways lined with metal cribs, children crying out in pain or pleading for water with no one to hold them. A knock at the door, a telegram notified parents to come retrieve their child's body. By August, every isolation bed in New York was occupied. Many held 3 children. A baby died approximately every 2.5 hours. Fear bordering on hysteria permeated the city. And then, when the weather turned cool, poliomyelitis disappeared, just as unexpectedly as it had come. In America's first major epidemic, the polio virus had infected approximately 8,900 in New York, leaving 2,400 dead, many of the remainder paralyzed. Nationwide, it had afflicted 27,000, mostly children under 5 years of age. For the next 40 years, the carefree spirit of summertime was marred by the specter of this disease, known simply as polio. Well, the biggest challenge of any biographer is to actually capture your subject, simulate their life, make them come alive, get that spark of vitality. As one biographer said, you need to get behind the legend without destroying the man. When Jonas Salk was asked what he wanted his biographer to write one day, he said, "The truth." Well, that wasn't always easy because Salk was a very introverted, private person. But after 10 years of pondering Jonas Salk, this is what I concluded. Jonas Salk was an enigmatic man. After 1995, he forged a protective shield, making it difficult to reconcile the paradoxes of his life. He was far more complex than the public image of him as America's beloved hero, and yet far more sensitive and caring than the distorted image suggested by some scientists, a stubborn, standoffish, glory-seeking dilettante. Introspective and mild-mannered, he presented a calm demeanor to the world while he carried enormous inner burdens. He loathed confrontation, yet he was surrounded by controversy. He longed to be accepted, but he challenged prevailing norms with unremitting tenacity. Above all, Jonas Salk was an idealist. As a boy, he prayed that one day he would perform some noble deed, and he did. That same boy craved acceptance from his peers and a connection with someone that transcended the ordinary. He never realized either. His dreams and ambitions, his passion to solve the problems of the world, both enshrined and isolated him, vaulted him to fame and confined him to loneliness. In the end, Salk's drive to aid humanity trumped his inner needs, and the world is better for it. Thank you.
All right. Dr. Jacobs will take your questions, And Kelly will take them on that side. Kelly, what's that on your hand?
Definitely.
Oh, looks like something new. Don't hide it. Kelly was just become engaged. Congratulations to Jim, who's over there. Jim? All right. Questions?
The fact that he came up with protection for the fact that he came up with protection for polio in 3 months, does that mean he was smarter than all the other scientists or just lucky?
Well, I think he was absolutely one of the most tenacious people you'd ever know. He worked his laboratory day and night, but it is easier to make a killed vaccine than to make a live vaccine. If you have a live virus, in order to weaken it, it has to go through multiple different transfers through animals to weaken. So the fact that he was making a killed vaccine made it much faster. He also did not have any oversight. I mean, he could never do that today. No one could. So a little bit of both, but not luck, hard work.
Kelly?
Why is poliomyelitis associated with children? Do adults develop neurological resistance to it or immunological resistance to it?
Yeah. So, interestingly, poliomyelitis came about because we introduced sanitation into the United States. So before that time, before we had good sanitation, children were exposed to the polio virus very early in life when they still had antibodies that had been transferred to from their mother in utero. So they'd be exposed to it, and then they already had her antibodies. So they might get a mild case, and then they would be immune for life. Well, once we had sanitation, people couldn't understand why polio was a disease more of the middle and upper socioeconomic groups and why it was more common in children. Well, what happened then is that children wouldn't be exposed to the polio virus necessarily in those first few months in those socioeconomic groups. So they got their mother's antibodies, but they weren't exposed, so they didn't develop immunity. And then in 2 months, when those antibodies are gone and the child was exposed, it was devastating to them. But adults did get polio as well, but many of them early on had developed immunity from the time that they were children. So it took a while to catch up.
Okay, question back here.
Just within the past few days, I believe it was 2 women were murdered while trying to campaign for the distribution of polio vaccine, and it was viewed as a Zionist plot. Was there any anti-Semitism involved with the rejection of Salk and his findings?
I didn't get I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the very end. Was there any?
Sure. Was anti-Semitism a part of the rejection of Salk and his findings?
Oh, thank you. Well, interestingly, David Oshinsky, who wrote this wonderful history of polio, he and I disagree on this one point. I said to him, well, if it was anti-Semitism, well, Albert Sabin, who was his greatest contentious person, was also Jewish, and they both came from very similar backgrounds. So I don't think that there was anti-Semitism too much. I mean, there may have been a small amount. Many of these scientists were trained at the Rockefeller Institute. That was the place to go if you were a serious scientist. And Sabin was trained there, and they never accepted Jonas Salk when he was training, and there may have been a little anti-Semitism involved there. But I think not the rejection of him as a scientist.
Here's another question back here.
You mentioned his rambling philosophical writings. Did you discover any useful insight into who the man really was from those?
No. And so his night writings, I should go back. His night writings, which I would have loved to get my hands on, because that was where I really could have learned more about Jonas Salk, are under lock and key and not available to the public, and were never made available to me. But so his writings show more about him and how much he cared about mankind and how much he was concerned about the fate of mankind. And they do take a little work, or they did for me, because I don't have a great philosophical background, but they do take a little work to ferret it out. So I think you could learn about his deep commitment to mankind and his concerns, but it didn't give me a lot of insight into Jonas Salk as a person. Does that answer your question?
Question back here.
So you said polio was from like spring to fall. How did it spread?
So it was spread by oral fecal route, so people not washing their hands after they go to the toilet was the major way that it was spread. It can be spread through saliva, but only usually during epidemics. So,
Yes, question here.
My brother had polio during the epidemic in the 50s, and the rest of the family was quarantined. They wouldn't let my father back in the house because he had to make a living elsewhere. But I remember, I was awfully young, but I remember being told that there were either 6 or 7 levels of polio or 6 or 7 different kinds of polio. And my brother had one, and I'm reaching back now, either bulbar or bulger, and it was supposed to be the worst. He was supposed to be, he was either supposed to die or be paralyzed from the neck down, and neither happened, and he ended up serving in the Army. But I'm wondering was it 6 or 7 different kinds, or
Yep.
6 or 7 different levels? And am I right, was it bulger or bulbar?
yeah, bulbar. So you're right. There were 3 different strains of polio virus that Salk and his group were able to find. And some of them are more lethal than others, and one of them was more likely to attack up at the base of the brain. That was what was called bulbar. And they often would be paralyzed from the waist down, but when it paralyzed their ability to swallow, that was a cause of death.
Dr. Jacobs, I understand that during your career, there was a change in the kind of person that was put in as the head of the FDA. It used to be a professional who was a civil servant, and then it was changed to be a political appointee. Is that correct?
I think so. I actually don't remember a lot of the history, although I was on the FDA advisory committee. But
my understanding, it was maybe 1988 with President Reagan.
Mm-hmm.
But my question is, if you have any insight into the effect of that political change.
on Salk or on
No. I'm talking more generally about all of us and the FDA and the health of this country.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I really feel confident giving you a good opinion of that. Having worked with the FDA, I think they do feel that they are the safeguards for the public health. And many people are always concerned that they're too slow, particularly in my field, in oncology. They're always concerned that the FDA is too slow to pick up on new treatments. For sure, there have been political overtones, particularly during the AIDS epidemic. But I can't really answer your question to any satisfaction, I'm afraid.
Yes. I was wondering if you could comment a little about the wealth of Jonas Salk in terms of what happened. You know, he had the initial vaccine. Obviously, I assume that resulted in some considerable wealth for him. And then with the substitution with Sabin and all of that, and we got some sense with his institute being set up. You indicated there that he didn't do too well, but I just wondered in terms of
Yep.
his.
It's a very
economics.
good question. Jonas Salk had very little money. Money wasn't a big thing for him. So he made a very famous statement the night of the vaccine announcement when the interviewer said to him, well, do you own the patent? Or who owns the patent? And Jonas Salk said, how could you patent the sun? Well, those are the kind of statements Jonas Salk would make that the public just melted. I mean, if they didn't love him enough then, they really loved him. They thought, wow, Jonas Salk has given up the patent to us. Well, in reality, if you were doing work for the National Foundation, you couldn't hold a patent. So he received not a penny from that vaccine. The National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, later just called the National Foundation, that did the March of Dimes, was a very, very wealthy organization. And so they paid the $75 million or whatever it was for the trial. And then Basil O'Connor, who adored Jonas Salk, that was their friendship was quite amazing, bought into the whole concept of Salk Institute and gave the funding to start and maintain the Salk Institute, millions and millions of dollars. And I talked to one of the directors at the Salk Institute during that time, and he said that we all sat down, and Basil O'Connor came in and said, okay, what's our next project going to be? What illness? And he said, well, we're going to support the Salk Institute. We're going to build the Salk Institute. And they kind of almost all fell off their chair. The Institute paid for Salk's house, rental of a house, and gave him a stipend. But he was never a wealthy man. His books didn't sell well. So he wasn't. He never got much for the work he did.